Welcome everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a program by Nick Grossman, who is a teaching assistant professor of international relations at the University of Illinois. He's going to be speaking to us today on Russian electoral interference and 21st century information warfare. I am Megan Phillips, co-director of ICFRC and your host for today's program. We would like to take a moment to thank our members, volunteers, and sponsors for making these programs possible. We would also like to thank our organizational supporters, UI Honors Program, the UI Public Policy Center, the UI International Program, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. We also thank City Channel 4 for continuing to help us make these programs available to viewing audiences. Our format today is the usual one. Following our speaker's presentation at about 1 p.m., we will have a Q&A session. You can submit those questions in the chat function on Zoom or by comment on Facebook. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Nick Grossman. Again, Nick Grossman is a teaching assistant professor of international relations at the University of Illinois. He is the author of Drones and Terrorism and the senior editor of Arc Digital. You can also find him on Twitter at ngrossman81. So please join me in welcoming Nick Grossman.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Foreign Relations Council. Thanks for having me. So today, what I'm going to talk to you about is influence operations, information warfare, electoral interference. It is a timely topic. I think we picked this date on purpose. You can see that's my 5-year-old's artwork in my little kind of COVID teaching spawn. So here we go. Let me share the screen, and I will make sure to leave time for questions. So please ask me whatever you want. Okay. Slideshow. Here we go. So what Russia calls this, and this is a Soviet era term, but is active measures, which basically means political warfare. And Russia post-Cold War, but especially under Putin, has had a goal of expanding Russian power in its near abroad, especially Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, and to gain relative power globally, especially against the United States and Europe. And so the practical application for this is they aim to undermine and ideally break up the European Union and NATO. And so they aim to influence politics in these countries, especially Europe and North America, also in other places, but especially those. And one of the ways is to finance various parties, far-right parties in Europe, like the National Front in France, which changed its name recently, but same party, Jobbik in Hungary, Northern League in Italy, and others. But also, interestingly, gives loans and other support to some far-left parties, like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. And the takeaway from this is these parties don't necessarily have pro-Russia stances. They are, not ones that have any particular, say, ideology that Russia really likes, except that they are generally anti-establishment, anti-EU. So they're more nationalist. They advocate being separate from either the European Union or Euro currency or NATO or other organizations like that, which they genuinely want for various reasons. But that serves Russia's interests of trying to break up these organizations, because from Russia's perspective, and this is pretty universal, but from Russia's perspective, having enemies divided is better than having enemies united. So anti-establishment parties anywhere, and you'll see this play in a bit when I show you some things from 2016. So this is a new style of propaganda, and it's one that Putin really excelled at, but it is far from only Russian. And so the new style, and kind of important to understand this information age style of propaganda, is the old style aimed to convince people that something that was false is actually true. So for an example, the Soviet paper Pravda, which means truth, and which inspired a lot of references to Orwell's Ministry of Truth in 1984. But Pravda and other Soviet outlets would say that the Soviet Union was winning its war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And this was false, just not true. And eventually they pulled out at the end of the 80s. And so that's a good example of something where it's false, but they want you to think something is actually true. And then a common technique would be something that's known as whataboutism, which is now more prevalent, but it's basically a distraction technique. It's a response to an accusation, was saying, oh, well, what about this other thing? What about that? How come you're not talking about that? So for example, say in the Cold War, if a US official would criticize Soviet human rights violations, maybe a Soviet official or a media outlet or something would respond by saying, what about all those civil rights violations in the United States? What about all the oppression of African Americans? How come nobody's talking about that, huh? And if you are familiar, if you've participated in internet discourse and some, maybe larger media discourse, you've probably seen some of this before. It's not that that other thing isn't a problem. It's just that the reason why you're bringing it up is to distract from the problem we're currently talking about. So that's more an old school propaganda. The new version is not so much to convince people that a false thing is true, it's to convince people to doubt truth, to doubt the idea of objective truth itself. So one is to push the idea, everybody lies, everyone spins, everyone has an agenda, nobody's really being honest with you. At least we're being honest with you that we are lying and have an agenda, and we're doing it for you. So to try to get people to kind of throw their hands up and say, oh, who can know what's true here, and to check out or to just go with their side. One of the techniques in this is to discredit media, government, establishment, university professors, anybody that is an objective source of an independent, objective might be a little strong, an independent source of independent authority of information. And there's a great book about Putin's Russia that the title distills this idea, which is nothing is true and everything is possible. So once you agree, once you become convinced that you can't really know the truth, well, then you could believe just about anything, right? Another part of this goal is to amplify division and divisive voices. It's really hard to create a political controversy out of nowhere. It is much easier to take existing divisive voices and to amplify them, to make them seem bigger than they actually are. Another element, introduce hacked or manufactured material to make a target look bad. We saw some of this in 2016, especially targeting Democrats and Hillary Clinton. Taking information and publicizing it is maybe not on its own bad. When you take information and only publicize a selective portion of it, that is aimed at manipulation. And then to undermine domestic and international unity and to spread whataboutism to basically everything. That there is no accusation you can't try to whatabout away. And that also plays into the doubting truth idea. To do this, Russia has mutually reinforcing channels. The kind of crown jewel in this is Russia Today, or that's what it used to be known as. It's now called RT, and its younger cousin Sputnik. They produce Russia slanting news. So these are Russian state media, but they often do not present as such. And they are aimed internationally, not just Russia domestically. RT has TV that broadcasts in English, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, German, and French. Sputnik has 40+ languages in radio. One that, for example, RT doesn't have that's important for Sputnik is Brazilian Portuguese. And because they're state media, they can afford to lose money. So organizations like CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, these big media organizations, Fox News, all of them are businesses. They need to make money. And one of the things, especially with America, that Americans don't really like to pay that much attention to is the rest of the world, especially, say, countries that maybe America isn't that close to. But what that means is when something happens there that actually does attract international attention, say war breaking out in Ukraine, then there are various internet aggregators who go looking for something to produce. Think this is sites like Yahoo or the Huffington Post. And they look for somebody else's reporting to republish. And who has coverage of Ukraine? Well, RT does. And so without necessarily knowing it, they pick that up, they republish it as themselves, and they effectively launder it. RT also gives shows to anti-establishment figures in target countries, people who maybe couldn't get a show on a mainstream network, but this helps them do a little better than they would on their own on YouTube. An example of this is there's a man on RT English, an American named Lee Camp, who is a comedian, and he presents himself as like telling the truth that they don't want you to know, and that the reason why he doesn't have, say, a show on, I don't know, NBC is because they're trying to keep me silent. And I've watched a bit of his stuff, and my guess is the reason why he doesn't have a show on, say, NBC is because he's not funny. But RT can afford to lose money. So even if he can't attract a big enough audience to make it that something like, say, NBC would profit, he can bring enough people to RT that he can maybe reinforce this anti-establishment argument, and that can potentially serve their interest. And they do a lot of these with different people. And RT and Sputnik News, it usually looks and sounds like real news. Sometimes it's factual, and sometimes it can be a little slanted, and every once in a while it's outright false. And I'll show you some examples of those in a bit. Then complementing this, there's Russia's infamous troll army, or troll farms, which are literally just people in a office building, or a warehouse or something, logging on to the internet and trying to troll people, basically mess with people. And they go to message boards, comment sections, especially social media, and spread disinformation, stoke division. Sometimes it's just annoying, just cast doubt on, show up whenever there's some, I don't know, every time there's some politician that Russia doesn't like, just whenever they make a statement, just have somebody respond, you're lying, every time. Something like that, for example. Or to just argue with random people, not necessarily somebody famous. These also provide avenues for releasing stolen and manufactured information and drawing attention to it. It could be also by proxies like WikiLeaks in 2016, or say local politicians that have an interest in smearing a particular candidate. And they also try to get it laundered through media. So it's not quite enough to show something on Russia Today. The ideal is to get it picked up by all the mainstream media also. And then it becomes a topic that people are discussing, where even if there's some element of debunking, you're still making more people aware of the information than were otherwise. They also bought ads on Facebook and Google, set up some Facebook pages. This part is a little overrated in the popular imagination, but it's still relevant. And these techniques were used, that we know of, to try to influence the Brexit referendum, the 2016 US presidential election, 2017 French presidential election, the Spanish Catalonian independence referendum, the 2018 US midterms, and others. Here's an example of RT, just something that I pulled out when I was looking at their website that struck me about 2 years ago, this is news about the US-China trade war, and it was a perfectly normal news topic for people to cover. And the picture that they chose I thought was kind of odd, because the majority of news articles on this topic had something generic about trade, so shipping containers, for example, or people on a stock exchange, or maybe a picture of like a map of the US and a map of China. And this one chose to have a tractor, this picture's from the Iowa State Fair, to have a tractor with Trump symbols on it, which fit with the argument from the Trump administration that they were doing this to help farmers. And I don't think this is any sort of grand conspiracy or anything. It just stood out to me because I edit a website. I can tell you that behind the scenes, we pick what picture goes up on an article. We think about it, sometimes not much, but we do put some thought into it. It is a human choice. All of these things behind media mean that somebody is making some choice. And this choice struck me as a little odd, and I'd say typical of RT putting a slant on the news. Here's one that's more dramatic, where RT's Twitter account in English has something in the range of 5 million followers. The Spanish language account has something in the range of 5 million followers. Their followings on Facebook are comparably sized. If you're not familiar with those platforms, those aren't the largest accounts, but they're quite big. And here is one tweet from RT, which claimed that a false flag attack, chemical attack in Syria, was being prepared by France, Belgium, and the White Helmets. The White Helmets are a nonprofit organization that goes to the sites of violence in Syria and tries to help the victims. They're thought of by basically everyone outside of the Syrian government, Iranian government, and Russian government as a really positive force. But because the Syrian government, which is partnered with Russia, has been attacking civilians, including with chemicals, the White Helmets, by going to attend to those civilians, publicize this to the world. And what was so odd about this tweet is, if you notice the language of it, the chemical attack hadn't happened yet. So they were spreading a conspiracy theory about something that hadn't happened yet. It was not quite a rebuttal, it was like a prebuttal. It was like they were seeding the ground for an attempt to spin away an action by the Syrian government, by their ally, as something that was done by somebody else. I am very confident on this one, as are basically everybody who studies this, that, say, Belgium never had anything to do with one of the Syrian government's chemical attacks. The troll army itself has different components. There are human users, this is the most common, and they will dispute things like media and government accounts. Sometimes they impersonate Americans, claim to be a normal American doing normal American politics stuff. Sometimes, every once in a while, they'll make explicit, pro-Russian arguments. They work to integrate themselves into existing anti-establishment political networks in the US, especially in 2016. That was both alt-right and far left. Note that much like in the European parties that they support, that Russia supports, here the trolls are supporting anti-establishment candidates on either side of the political spectrum, or anti-establishment arguments on either side of the political spectrum. So it's not so much the argument itself, it's the anti-establishment divisive quality of it. Trolls also can retweet and otherwise spread favorable content, sometimes by other Russian trolls, sometimes by RT, a lot of times by people in their target countries who they want to promote. And the Internet Research Agency is the most well-known Russian troll farm, and that was indicted by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. The indictment says that, so it's 13 Russian nationals, 3 Russian entities, including the IRA, and accuses them of, among other crimes, identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and the biggest charge, conspiracy against the United States. And according to the Mueller indictment, the IRA was spending about $1.25 million per month on its political operations. I mean, when I say indictment, it's not like the Russian government is going to arrest these people and send them to the United States. So I doubt they'll ever go on trial. But it's an interesting indictment to read because it's more detailed than most of them, as if they knew they would never get an actual trial. In addition to the trolls, there are bots. Those are automated programs. Their job is to amplify favorable content and to get various topics or phrases trending. The social media companies crack down on these whenever they can. A Twitter spokesperson recently said that they shut down about 800,000 bot accounts every day. And the reason why that is so hard to try to shut down is because opening a new bot account is really easy. You can do it with an automated program with a script, and just have a computer open new ones. So as soon as they close some, just open others. And it's a problem that the tech companies are constantly trying to manage. And then there's something they call cyborgs, which are accounts that are sometimes automated bots and sometimes run by humans, and that both throws off the bot censors in the social media companies and also can help grow their following. And here's an example of something where I'll show you a specific one of RT and these other networks taking a real event and making it seem much better than it actually was, or much bigger, sorry, not better, bigger. Definitely important on that one, bigger, than it actually was. So here was something, this was in 2017. There were a protest, a right-wing, what they call the Patriot Prayer protest or rally in Berkeley, California, and with connections to alt-right networks, and left-wing counter-protesters, some with connections to Antifa networks, and that they were rallying together and or rallying, against each other, but in the same spot. And it wasn't that nothing happened. It was just, relatively small. Maybe a couple people got a little hurt. There were a couple arrests, but not that big. And RT played it up like it was the biggest thing going on. And you can see a lot of these different posts, those screenshots of them all from the same day of trying to turn this into a big news story. And the most interesting one, the biggest photo there in the bottom right, that is from Germany from a couple years ago. So whereas, I assume that that's because a lot of the photos coming out of Berkeley weren't big enough, or maybe it's just really low journalistic standards and they never bothered correcting the error. But still, that's not the sort of thing a real media organization would do, or if they did it accidentally, they would very quickly correct it. And RT didn't because they're not trying to be a real media organization. They're just trying to seem like one. There's a neat resource called the Hamilton Dashboard that tracks a number of Russian influence related accounts. That related is really important, meaning they can't really tell if these are Russian government people hired, like freelancers or contractors hired by the Russian government, or people who just by expressing themselves happen to agree with whatever the Russian government is trying to push at the moment. And you can see this is Twitter specific, but the both top hashtags and the trending hashtags, so things that they were able to draw a lot of attention to by these accounts, Berkeley was #1, and where they focused on it a lot. Also, this tells you of when it was from, because you can see things like Hurricane Harvey in Houston. That's when, say this took place. The other big event. So obviously they're not controlling all of this, but by drawing additional attention to the Berkeley protests, they can make it seem on social media like it's a bigger event than it is, which then attracts additional media attention. And that's what happened. So there was RT amplifying this event, Russian trolls deliberately amplifying the event, and a lot of alt-right accounts, including, say, more influential accounts, more larger accounts, and they were trying to amplify it too and to make it into a really big deal. And this is a good example of a kind of symbiosis where I have no reason to suspect that these people were working together. You know, that say any of the Americans who wanted to treat this protest like a really big deal were, say, working for the Russian government, or, you know, I mean, I don't have any evidence for that. I don't buy that. They are doing it on their own. They just happen to be somebody that the Russian government wants to amplify. And so the two end up working in concert to make the story seem bigger. And as they were doing this, it got the attention of some Fox News hosts, including Sean Hannity, who first started commenting about it on Twitter, and then covered the events on their shows on Fox. And then pretty quickly thereafter, started complaining that the mainstream media was trying to hide this, that why aren't they covering it? This is such an important thing, why are they blacking it out? And a little while later, the Washington Post and CNN started covering this event and treating it, again, like a bigger deal. So it's not that it didn't matter, it's just that it didn't matter as much as they convinced people that it mattered. And you can see here how that process, starting on the internet, starting on social media, can eventually manipulate the mainstream narrative in the United States. Now I'm going to tell you the story about 10GOP. 10GOP is the biggest, kind of most prolific, most successful Russian troll that we know of. Had over 130,000 Twitter followers before Twitter caught him and shut him down in July 2017. Was also very active on Reddit, especially a subreddit, a board on Reddit called Are the Donald, which is a forum for Trump fans. He, I guess I've been saying he, but you know, I don't even know, could be she, pretended to be a Republican from Tennessee. That's the name, 10 for Tennessee, GOP for Republican, and gained a lot of followers by integrating with existing conservative, Trumpist, and alt-right networks. So in some cases would have kind of generic pro-military, pro-cop statements get more followers, also like cute animal photos, made some pro-Trump, anti-Hillary comments, and then would go a little further with anti-Muslim comments, conspiracy theories, and then especially what stood out and maybe what helped identify as a Russian troll was some pro-Assad commentary. It would be pretty odd for a Republican from Tennessee in the midst of a US presidential election to be focused on praising the dictator of Syria. And here are some examples of 10GOP posts. So you can see in the top left, police officers playing with a lost toddler before they found his family and returned him home. So cute, thank you for your service. You know, who wouldn't find that positive? And especially people who are supportive of the police, you know, police as an institution, or, you know, individual police members. See in the bottom left in the center, it's kind of anti-Hillary, Hillary's a liar, Trump's always talking to his supporters. And then bottom right is Muslim man explains by saying Merry Christmas is worse than murder. That's a pretty good example of what I call Islamophobic, or at least, you know, trying to spread anti-Muslim sentiment. And the one that stood out the most, the top right, Syria's Christians in Aleppo celebrate Easter for the first time in 5 years. And that was a Syrian and Russian government propaganda line. The Syrian government bombed the heck out of Aleppo and killed a lot of people. And they tried to frame this, killed all sorts of people. And they tried to frame this as freeing, or at least frame it for the West, as freeing Aleppo's poor oppressed Christians from brutal Muslim terrorists. And that is also something that I would call not exactly an accurate portrayal of what happened there. But here's 10GOP claiming to be a Republican from Tennessee, celebrating that spin on the conflict in Syria. And 10GOP was really good at integrating with existing accounts. I'll just name a few of these. If you look at the first one, so green are the ones where somebody retweeted 10GOP, that someone else shared a post by 10GOP. And the red ones are the times that 10GOP shared a post by somebody else. So you can see right at the top, 10GOP shared 19 different Trump posts. That's the president at the top. But Trump never shared 10GOP back. But there's Donald Trump Jr., so the president's son, sharing him, Eric Trump. The next one's Kellyanne Conway, Sean Spicer, the former press secretary, If you go down a little lower, big integration with Cernovich, Jack Posobiec. Those are Pizzagate conspiracy theorists and alt-right influencers. In the top right, you see my thing moving around right there. That is Michael Flynn Jr. That was Trump's first national security advisor's son, who was also an official on the Trump transition team. Some of the other ones here have Ingram Angle, that's Laura Ingram at the bottom, some other pro-Trump media. Roger Stone is Trump's political advisor who had been convicted of a variety of crimes, including witness tampering, that the president recently commuted his sentence. And Coulter is on there too. So you can see where 10 GOP was able to attract the attention of a lot of pretty influential, famous people on the American right and convince them, presumably, that he was one of them as opposed to a Russian troll messing with them. And 10 GOP got famous. So part of this was boosted by the integrated Russian networks. So 10 GOP shared some articles by RT and Sputnik in turn cited 10 GOP in their articles and shared some quotes from 10 GOP or some tweets, which you can see on the right. And then at the bottom, if you notice, that is a bunch of really famous, successful media organizations. So Glenn Greenwald, that is the Intercept journalist who broke the Edward Snowden story, but also LA Times, Washington Post, referenced 10 GOP as an American conservative voice you got to listen to. You know, so in the context of, do you want to understand why so many Americans are supporting Donald Trump? You need to listen to somebody like 10 GOP, who is the sort of American that is going to shape things, and of course was not an American, was just good at pretending to be one. For the 2016 election specifically, the strategy on Facebook, so a lot of that I just told you about was on Twitter, on Facebook to set up pages and groups, to create some content that was shared by users, whether false or not, and then also ads, which are cheap and targeted. And an advantage of Facebook ads is you can somewhat profile the people you're going to send it to, and that other people don't see it. So if you aired something, if you say bought a commercial, I don't know, during the World Series, everybody who watches the World Series will see it. If you buy an ad on Facebook, only the people you target will see it. So other people won't know. And here's an example of a free page that Russian trolls created. So this was a group called Secure Borders, which they made up, and they had an event called Citizens Before Refugees in Idaho. This was a reference to a claim that refugees had raped an 11-year-old girl, and it was picked up by InfoWars' Alex Jones, among others, and reached the point where both the local sheriff and the head of the Iowa State Police released public statements saying, nothing like this happened. We have no evidence of this. We don't know what you're talking about. We would definitely know if this happened, and it didn't. But they still had this event. Here are two competing events that they managed to organize in Texas that were against each other. So they created two fake groups, one called United Muslims of America, one called Heart of Texas, and then had, which is mostly, so Heart of Texas, primarily anti-immigrant, and then had the two groups, they declared an event, a protest, come check this out. And you can see in some of them, the Heart of Texas group, those are the people with the Confederate flags and the white power symbols. And the United Muslims of America are the pictures of the ones saying things like, we welcome Muslims here. And you can see in the photo in the top, in the middle of my screen, that there are police in the way. So fortunately, police managed to figure this out. And not that Russia was behind it, but that these two groups were rallying in the same place and stand between them. And so there wasn't violence. But this is an entirely manufactured event. Neither of these groups are real, and yet a bunch of real people came out to support them. When it comes to ads, when it comes to ads specifically, Facebook had reported that they knew of at least $180,000 spent in ads, that those ads reached millions of Americans. Most of the candidate-related ads were anti-Clinton and pro-Trump, but there were also ads that were pro-Bernie Sanders, anti-Marco Rubio, anti-Ted Cruz. And note again, here is the anti-establishment sentiment taking precedent, not any specific candidate support. So Putin really doesn't like Hillary Clinton, blames her for, among other things, protests in Ukraine against a pro-Russian leader. But overall, Clinton was the establishment candidate in the Democratic primary, Sanders the anti-establishment candidate, so Russia backs Sanders, unofficially. And similar thing, Trump was the anti-establishment candidate in the Republican primary. Rubio and Cruz were establishment candidates, so they go after Rubio and Cruz and support Trump. And then in the general election, Trump is clearly the establishment candidate, while Clinton, the anti-establishment candidate, Clinton pro-establishment, and therefore they're big supporters of Trump. That's not the only reason, but a big part of it. But if you notice, they are not, say, pro-Republican, anti-Democrat. It is pro-anti-establishment. Pro-anti, yeah, I know, I just did that, but still. Here's some examples of the ads. Most of these are promotion for groups that they created. So not just the ads themselves. Of course, it's important to note that the ad spending here is completely dwarfed by the candidates. You know, it's not even close. So it's not like their ads overwhelmed other ads. They more manipulated people on the margins and helped drive people to the free groups, which were able to operate at a higher scale. You can see a pro-Trump, minors for Trump one top left. This one in the middle is the one that everybody seems to always get a kick out of. I think it's kind of funny, but you know, with Jesus and Satan arm wrestling over the election. And then the one on the right of Bernie Sanders, a group called Born Liberal. Again, these are all ones Russia created that says the Clinton Foundation is a problem. And again, good example of highlighting, amplifying an existing issue, not trying to create one out of whole cloth. Bernie Sanders really did criticize the Clinton Foundation. And, you know, as did some other people, as a potential conflict of interest. And therefore, from Russia's perspective, amplifying that could be beneficial, could aid the anti-establishment project. After the 2016 election, or you know what, I'll take a step back. So first, the 2016 election specifically, I don't know, and nobody knows, what effect Russia's efforts had. The only way we could possibly know would be if we could go to some parallel universe and rerun the 2016 election without Russia's involvement. It is possible that Trump would have won without their help. It's possible that maybe Trump would have won by more because, say, criticism over Russian involvement made a lot of national security conservatives leave the Republican Party. You know, for example, it's possible that Hillary would have won if Russia didn't do anything, or possible it has no effect. So we don't actually know. What we do know is that it clearly had an effect on US politics. I mean, here I am talking to you. And it also had a large effect on the way that various governments, including the Russian government, see these type of operations, which is that whether the operation itself was successful or not, everybody is treating it like it was. The Russian government thinks it was a success, Russian intelligence thinks it was a success, various other countries, including China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, think it is a success, and their intelligence agencies are trying to do something similar. So overall, we will see more of this, not less. But I do need the caveat of we don't actually know, we cannot know with any sort of objective certainty how this affected any electoral result. But we do know that the interference didn't stop with 2016. One example was US Cyber Command, that's the military cyber warfare division, disrupted internet access for the Internet Research Agency for the US 2018 midterm elections. So that Russian troll farm basically stopped working for a couple days around the midterms. During Trump's impeachment hearings in 2019, there were some Republican members of Congress who claimed that Ukraine was the one that was really behind 2016 electoral interference, not Russia. And Fiona Hill, who was a member of Trump's National Security Council, has worked for other presidents too, and is one of the premier Russian Eastern European experts in the world, testified under oath before Congress that the claim about Ukraine being really behind it was disinformation created by Russian intelligence to deflect blame for their own activities. And there were multiple members of Congress who were pushing that disinformation. On top of that, there's an ongoing effort to stoke divisions. And here's a good example of that. So they play both sides of various divisive issues. Here's one of the Black Lives Matter and police shooting controversies. So you can see a couple of these groups, BM, that stands for Black Matters, Woke Blacks, those are both ones that they made up that would then be pro-Black Lives Matter, some that are kind of generically pro-police, and then if you look at the bottom right, another gruesome attack on police by a BLM movement activist. So you have simultaneously Russian trolls saying how terrible it is that Black Lives Matter activist is violent, and also saying how terrible it is that police are violent against Black people. So they're playing both sides of the divisive issue. It's trying to heighten the division. I don't know any reason why Russia would really care who wins this argument. What they like is having it be a big argument. And just recently, that this timing works out really well. Before we scheduled this today, I didn't know this was going to break beforehand, but there's the controversy over a New York Post story. So last week, the New York Post published a story that had claims about Joe Biden's son, Hunter. It came from Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, who was Trump's personal attorney. And he said that he got emails off of a computer that Hunter dropped off for repairs in New Jersey, and the computer repairman told Rudy about it. And the story didn't make much sense. So for example, the store owner is legally blind and said he doesn't actually know who dropped off the laptop. He just thinks it might be Hunter. The metadata, that's the information like the timestamp or other behind the scenes information, showed that the emails were created months after the laptop was supposedly dropped off. And there have been some suspicions of Russian involvement. I think that's a little overstated. So at the last presidential debate, for example, Joe Biden said point blank that it was Russian disinformation. And at least based on public knowledge, I don't think we can say that. What I do know is that US intelligence warned the White House that Russian intelligence was trying to manipulate Rudy Giuliani and use him as a conduit for disinformation. They issued that warning last year. According to US intelligence, Rudy met with some people who are almost certainly Russian intelligence when he was in Ukraine. According to Rudy himself, he thinks it's about a 50-50 chance that some of the people he met with was Russian intelligence. And the MO is similar to Russian disinformation in that they mix in both factual, perhaps hacked or stolen information with also some fabrications. And that helps create more chaos. It makes it that either people believe the fabrications or gets arguments over if the whole thing is true or not. Another example of this is the somewhat infamous Steele dossier, which was some opposition research compiled by former British spy Christopher Steele against Donald Trump in 2016. It came out in 2017. And this was the one that included the accusation of the P tape, which you may have heard of. And it's now pretty clear that Russian intelligence fed Steele some information, some of which is true and some of which is fabricated. So this Hunter Biden thing has a similar MO, but we don't actually know if Russia was involved or not. But it is kind of a similar style. Facebook slowed the spread of this article. Twitter removed it. They blocked the URL so people couldn't post it. There was a big political controversy around it. The bottom right is what people saw on Twitter when they tried to post it. And there are actually hearings going on today in Congress about social media censorship. And it's a little, say, off scope, but I think really interesting topic in that critics say that social media companies were deliberately censoring content that might hurt a candidate that they like. And at the very least, even if they weren't doing that for that reason, that these unelected Silicon Valley executives should not be the ones determining whether people can see a story from a newspaper or not. Whereas the other side of that argument is that Facebook and Twitter are private companies, they're not the government. And why would they be under the obligation to, once they've identified something as bad information, deliberately manipulative information, why do they have to spread it for you? It's not silencing you, it's say, why would they spread it around for you? And, it's an interesting topic, I think, where for me, at least on that one, it is not clear what the answer is. It's a very difficult question. And then finally, oh, good, so I'll have time for a good amount of time for questions. Just want to leave you with some notes of caution, which is when I've given this presentation for people who are less familiar, say with internet communication, maybe less online all the time, or just with this style of political propaganda, now that I've mentioned it, you might start seeing it everywhere. I'm sort of in the way when you learn a new word and you realize that, oh, that word is around a lot more than I thought it was. I just didn't notice it before. So you might start noticing this in a lot of places, but let me caution you that the vast majority of online communication is real people expressing themselves. A lot of times real people expressing themselves make dumb arguments or say bigoted stuff or contradict themselves or who knows what, but it is a lot of real people. That the deliberate influence operations by foreign intelligence is a small part of all of online communication. And there's a danger in overstating the extent of and the effect of Russian and also Chinese, Iranian, Saudi, others influence operations, because it gives them more power. So when people say, when somebody disagrees with them online and they say something like, oh, you're just a Russian bot, or, shut up, Russian troll, or something like that, the person is probably a real person, probably not working for Russia. And that gives Russia more power. If you actually think that they can manipulate online discourse at that level, you are giving them more power. You are assuming that they have more power than they deserve. And then finally, I guess one I didn't add on here, but there was a recent study that the biggest source of misinformation in the United States is domestic, not foreign. An example was this big MIT study that found that the biggest source by far of inaccurate, false, or otherwise misleading information about COVID-19 is the White House, so not a foreign entity. Okay, and I think I will stop there. Thank you for having me again, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So yes, as Nick has said, we will move on to the Q&A portion of the program. So while you take a minute to think about questions for Nick, I want to remind you about our 2 upcoming programs. Next week, we will not have a program. We are leaving that week blank in honor of the elections, so make sure you will go out and vote. On Thursday, November 12th, we have a program by Mark Kendi, who is the director of the Drake Constitutional Law Center from Drake University. And then the week after that, on Wednesday, November 18th, we will have a presentation from Ted Powers, who's the Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Iowa. So be sure to register and attend those as well. So with that, please enter your questions in the chat box as you come up with them. I don't see any quite yet. So Nick, what I'll do is I'm gonna kick it off with one of my own questions. So this is a pretty broad question, but what can we do as individuals to make ourselves less vulnerable to falling for these things that we see online and in the news and such?
That's a great question, and I was thinking in advance about ending with that, and then just kind of slipped my mind. So thank you for asking. A lot of the answer is learning more about it and being cautious. Where or another way to put it is, don't believe everything you read on the internet. That especially also don't share things unless you know what they are. So click on the article, maybe consider what the origin might be before you share it. Be cautious about things like people trying to make you mad, trying to make you outraged. Outrage sells online like nothing else. And I am somewhat optimistic about this, that at the individual learning level. So it is possible that Russia's 2016 operations end up going down in history like September 11th or Pearl Harbor or the Trojan Horse, of something where it's a kind of loophole exploiting surprise attack, that by doing it, it then closes the loophole. And in that, people seem much warier. So to use the New York Post Hunter Biden story as an example, there was a lot of media reaction of hesitancy towards it, where 2016, a lot of these organizations would have put this on the front page immediately. And instead, their reaction now was, looks like somebody's trying to manipulate us. Let's be cautious on this one. Let's hold off. So part of it, I think, is individuals educating themselves and being better internet citizens. Part of it is things like government fighting back against it, and I guess the most polite way I can put this is the United States will probably fight back against this more or less, depending on how the presidential election goes. But overall, yeah, better citizens, more government involvement, and more responsible behavior from media organizations and tech companies. Although there is also the risk of overdoing it. So like, for example, if I were Twitter, I would not have completely blocked that New York Post story. Maybe something like a warning of, this may be misinformation. Do you want to still read the article? So people could still have the choice. So I see some questions coming in. Have you seen any initiatives in other countries that have been particularly successful at fighting Russian or other foreign disinformation? Particularly successful, no. It's a really tough nut to crack, because in a way it uses the West's kind of free society against ourselves. So we have free speech, we have a free press, and that means that somebody can introduce bad information and that information can spread, and it would be, I think, a pretty serious free speech violation for the government to censor it. You may disagree, but I think that the government stepping in to censor things like social media posts is a cure that's worse than the disease. So there's all sorts of potential for abuse. Some of the Europeans have been pretty good. The Dutch maybe are the best at it, of identifying information, adding warning labels, of educating people. They have, some European countries have things like high school classes or high school lessons, at least, on disinformation. I think that would be a really great thing for people to, to say for a lot of countries to do. The UK has, and the US started doing this too, of identifying foreign state media as foreign state media. So if you look at the RT account on Twitter, you will see something that says Russian, paid for by the Russian state or something like that, or Russian state media. So that's some of it, but particularly successful, unfortunately, no, not really. Seems to me the GOP is using some of the techniques you talked about. You probably don't want to be political, but can you talk about this? You know what, sure. And this is one of the weird things about being a political science professor during the Trump presidency, is I really want to be nonpartisan in at least professional context. And my job is to help people understand the world more, not to tell them what their values are, what to think, or something like that. But I am in the fact business. We're in the truth business here. And so when things like, I'll just give a good example of, I teach US foreign policy, and Trump declared there's no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. That is false. It's just simply false. And I teach about North Korea's nuclear program. I can't tell my students that maybe that's true or maybe it's false. I have to just sort of simply say it's false. And if you point out that the president is lying, many people consider that partisan nowadays. So I see no way around that. And I try to do my best with it, but truth over a forced balance, say, as a value. So with that as a caveat, Republicans are very much using some of the techniques that I've talked about. The ones that I thought were most egregious were the parroting the Russian disinformation on television in congressional hearings, that Ukraine was really doing stuff that Russia did as a way to kind of excuse Russia. And I don't know a good way to solve this problem, because the Republican Party clearly sees electoral advantage in it. And actually, that's not true. I think I do know a way to solve the problem, which is if they lose really big in the next election, they might rethink their strategy on Tuesday. But if it works, I'd expect them to do it more. Susan Loma says, thank you. You're welcome, Susan. And says, optimistic about our current situation is perhaps some of the divisiveness is manufactured. How can we possibly know the truth? So yes, some of the divisiveness is manufactured, though a lot of it is real. That unfortunately, remember, the goal is amplify divisions that already exist, not to manufacture them. But social media in particular, or media in general, really does amplify a lot of divisiveness. That something like Twitter or Facebook political arguments are more divisive. There's a psychological aspect about just typing on a computer, not having to look somebody in the eye when you say something that hurts them or makes them mad. So there's definitely some of that. It's the internet rather than a foreign government to some extent, and that's too big a problem to say we're not going to get rid of the internet. How to fix it. How can we possibly know the truth? I'd say kind of two. The way that I try to do it is one is to trust certain sources of information more than others. There are, the big media organizations, a big difference between them is while they get it wrong sometimes, they quickly, when people point out that they're wrong, they release corrections, and they should be better. I don't want to say they're above criticism, but I think they're generally trustworthy. That others that are more political, maybe less so, but the thing I try to do is read a variety of perspectives, read a variety of news, or consume a variety of news, and I think that kind of truth emerges from dialogue. That you don't need to force yourself to read propaganda or something that you can't stand, but looking at the different ways something gets covered. But how can we possibly know the truth is is a question that philosophers have been dealing with for thousands of years. So at that level, I don't know. Today's congressional hearing appears to view the problem as one of antitrust. My view is the problem is more of one of business plan, so the size of the company is almost irrelevant. So that's a reference to the hearings going on now with tech companies, especially I think Facebook and Twitter CEOs are there. I don't know if others are, but whenever tech CEOs, sometimes Google and get brought down before Microsoft even, or YouTube get brought down before Congress, it always is this weird situation where the people asking questions mostly don't seem to know what they're talking about, and end up like complaining about, say, a specific like maybe, I don't know, specific media, social media decision. And the problem with the social media companies is that they're not monopolies, but they also maybe kind of are, in that they play a role that is more extensive than the average private company. They're not something like, say, Standard Oil or AT&T. They are not the only ones. They're not able to manipulate prices as a result. They are, to some extent, though, able to manipulate information. And in the information age, that's a real important difference. So they're kind of government-like in that if they all stifle something, they can censor it almost at the level that a government could, but they're also definitely not the government. They're private corporations. And I don't think that, say, breaking up Twitter or breaking up Facebook would improve this situation. And if anything, breaking up Facebook would just be splitting off different networks that they own. So for example, they own Instagram, to make those two separate companies. But a large social media network is probably here to stay. So something like Twitter, other people have tried to do what amount to basically just Twitter competitors that are very much like Twitter, of companies called Gab and Parler. I wonder if any of you have ever heard of them, because we don't need another Twitter. We have it already. And YouTube is another example. We need a spot to go to watch videos online. We don't need another YouTube. Why would anybody put videos on a different video site when there's a bigger audience on YouTube? The only answer usually is people get kicked off YouTube. So this is a maybe indirect answer to your question, but I don't think antitrust is necessarily the solution. Maybe some regulations, but I don't necessarily want government getting involved with it. It's something I've been thinking about a lot and trying to come up with a solution. I don't have one yet. I hope to think of one, but it's a really thorny nut. Like, how do you deal with these companies that are very powerful, not the government, but kind of can do some government-like functions, but also are definitely private companies that have terms of service? It's complicated. What do you think drives whataboutism? I've experienced this from friends with different opinions. Yeah, it's a pretty common thing, and mostly is things like ideology and partisanship, and seeing politics more as maybe like a sports competition, like some sort of team sport, rather than as politics or government and deciding important life or death issues, and also some fairly boring, like how to name a postal service issues. So part of it, I think, is an unwillingness to confront, say, what their own side has done, or to want to see their side positively and see the other side negatively. So where, it's almost like a political combat, and search for hypocrisy. A lot of people, hypocrisy is a powerful argument. You don't care about this in general. You only care about this because it hurts some politician you don't like. And as soon as a politician you do like says it, then you're going to go back to not caring about it. I mean, I think that accusation is kind of true, at least for some people in some circumstances. So responding to whataboutism, where in conversations, especially someone you want to, I don't know, stay close with, I usually say something like, it's like, yeah, like that's also important, but can we finish talking about this? Or like, can we stay focused on this or something? And yeah, we can talk about that later. That's also bad, I agree. Or online, what I tend to do is, like, say, if I'm arguing on Twitter, if somebody tries, I usually just call it out and say something like, whataboutism isn't going to work around here, friend. We're worried about this other problem, or something like that. But the reason why it works so well is at a level, it's almost an unbeatable technique that it's very easy to get distracted. There is a lot of hypocrisy. Should platforms bear any responsibility for information published on their websites? So this, I think, I'm taking as like a Section 230 regulation question. And this, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a early internet regulation that basically created the internet as we know it. Sorry, not created, that's the wrong word, shaped the internet as we know it. And Sorry, I just saw the next question, lost my train of thought. But yeah, shape the internet as we know it. And what Section 30 says is that any website is responsible for content that it publishes. It is not responsible for user-generated content. So what that means is something like Twitter is responsible for an official statement by Twitter and then subject to things like, say, libel or slander or defamation or other laws like that. But Twitter is not responsible for every Twitter user's post or Facebook user's post. And this applies also to websites like, say, the Washington Post or Fox News or Breitbart or any of them, that they have comment sections. And if a user writes in something in a comment section, that is not the responsibility of the company. So if we didn't have that rule, and I'd say I'm a strong supporter of that rule, if we didn't have that rule, the result would be these companies would not allow user-generated comments. Because if you imagine if anything that somebody said that might be the subject of a lawsuit on, say, Facebook would end up in a lawsuit against Facebook, then Facebook would look at it as, we're not going to let anybody do anything that could get us get a lawsuit, say, focused at us. So I think the platforms do have some kind of ethical responsibility for the information published on their websites. An example of this is they crack down hard on jihadist propaganda. I used to, because I teach stuff about terrorism and write about it often, I would get ISIS recruitment videos posted in my timeline all the time, just a pretty frequent thing, and now that is gone. And I can't say I think that's a bad thing, that they have decided to censor that off of their platform. Where to draw the line, though, is a really hard question. But I would not want them to be responsible for all or even most of the information published on their websites, because then we can't do internet comments. We can't do social media anymore. Does the growth and spread of QAnon concern you? Is this an example of US-based conspiracy theory, or is it something from abroad? So yes, it definitely concerns me. I wrote an article that I can post to the chat specifically about this just recently. About QAnon and the concern for it. So let me get that. Here we go. Perfect. I got it nice and quickly. If you're curious of my longer thoughts on it, here you go. But so the answer is yes, it definitely concerns me. We've never really dealt with something like that. I could do a whole presentation on it, don't have the time for that now. But there is it's both a disconnect with reality and it's like a cult-like thing where a lot of it embraces violence. A lot of the people who are into it seem more lonely than violent, where there's almost like I don't know, puzzle, do puzzles with friends aspect of it. But there seem to be millions of adherents, at least tangentially. And if we assume that something like 99.9% are nonviolent, that still leaves thousands of people who would actually believe these theories and act on them. I'm concerned about how QAnon will react to the election if Trump loses, because to them, this isn't just a competition between two politicians with different visions for America. It is a evil, satanic, child sex trafficking cabal that is the evilest evil of ever, fighting against the grand savior of humanity. And if the grand savior of humanity loses to that terrible evil, how do you deal with it? How do you react? So yeah, I'm definitely concerned about it. We don't totally know where it comes from, but it is almost certainly US-based. It has now spread to some other countries, but it is much larger in the United States, likely originated in the United States on a website called 4chan, and by some anonymous posters. And there might be some element of maybe foreign kind of boosting of it, but not that I know of anything specific. And then someone says, thank you for the framework of disinformation. You're welcome.
All right. Well, since that's pretty much our time, I think we'll just wrap it up there. I don't see any more questions. So Nick, just a huge thank you for this presentation. It was very informative. I think people enjoyed it a lot. As a special thank you, we'd like to present you with, I believe, your second ICFRC coffee
Awesome.
mug.
Yep. I drank out of the first one. So
great. You'll have one for the shelf, maybe. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone watching. Thank you for being here today. And just one more thank you to our members, sponsors, and volunteers for making these possible. And with that, I will conclude the program for today. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks everybody.